The handcuffs clicked shut around Daniel Matthews's wrists with the cold precision of injustice. The metallic sound echoing across the cobblestone driveway of St. Bartholomew's Academy like a gunshot in a cathedral. Officer Bradley Kane's grip was unnecessarily firm as he forced the well-dressed black man against the hood of a pristine Mercedes, ignoring the horrified gasps of wealthy parents and the tears of a young girl crying, "Daddy." What Kane didn't know, what none of the stunned witnesses could have imagined, was that the man he was arresting for suspicious activity at an elite private school was Daniel Matthews, the district attorney of the county, a man whose signature appeared on Kane's own department's budget approvals and whose prosecutorial decisions could make or break police careers with a single case recommendation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of St. Bartholomew's Academy, where privilege wore the disguise of ivy-covered walls and meticulously maintained gardens. At exactly 3:15 p.m., the circular driveway began its daily transformation into a parade of luxury vehicles, Range Rovers, BMWs, and Tesla Model S sedans, gliding into position like chess pieces on a board made of imported Italian marble. Daniel Matthews's black Mercedes E-Class moved with quiet confidence through the pickup lane, its polished surface reflecting the Gothic Revival architecture that had housed the children of America's elite for over a century. Behind the wheel, Daniel adjusted his navy tie, a subtle gesture born from years of courtroom discipline, where every detail mattered and appearances could shift the balance of justice itself. At 42, Daniel possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His shoulders carried the weight of a career built on truth-telling, in a system that often preferred comfortable lies. The gray at his temples spoke to late nights spent reviewing case files, while his steady hands revealed a man who had learned to remain calm when others lost their composure. Today, like every Tuesday and Thursday, he was simply a father coming to collect his daughter. The car door closed with the soft precision of German engineering as Daniel stepped onto the cobblestone driveway. His charcoal suit, tailored on Savile Row during a conference in London, moved with him like a second skin. Other parents nodded in his direction, some with genuine warmth, others with the cautious politeness that wealth uses to mask uncertainty. He'd grown accustomed to both. Across the pickup area, near the stone lions that guarded the school's main entrance, Officer Bradley Kane leaned against his patrol car like a predator marking territory. At 38, Kane carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never questioned his own authority. His uniform was pressed to military standards, his badge polished to mirror brightness, but his eyes held something that no amount of training could disguise, the restless hunger of someone who measured his worth by the fear he could instill in others. Kane's gaze swept across the pickup area with practiced surveillance, cataloging faces, vehicles, and what he privately called irregularities. In his 12 years on the force, he had developed what he considered a finely tuned instinct for spotting trouble. The fact that his instincts aligned suspiciously well with his prejudices was a connection he had never bothered to examine. The radio on his shoulder crackled with routine dispatch chatter, but Kane's attention was elsewhere. He watched Daniel walk toward the school entrance with what struck him as too much confidence for someone who clearly didn't belong. The suit was expensive. Kane knew expensive when he saw it, but expense and legitimacy weren't the same thing, not in his experience. "Probably bought it hot," Kane muttered under his breath, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his service weapon. He'd seen it before. Criminals dressing up, trying to blend in with decent people, using stolen money to buy respectability they hadn't earned. The Mercedes was probably stolen too, or purchased with drug money. Kane's internal narrative wrote itself with the efficiency of long practice. Daniel paused at the school's bronze directory, scanning for his daughter's classroom number. Zoe was 8 years old, and in Miss Henderson's third-grade class, room 240, second floor, East Wing. These details occupied the same mental space where Daniel stored witness testimonies and legal precedents. Precision mattered, whether you were prosecuting a case or simply being a present father. The school's interior maintained the same aristocratic atmosphere as its facade. Oil paintings of deceased headmasters gazed down from mahogany-paneled walls, while Persian rugs muffled the footsteps of students and faculty moving through hallways wide enough to accommodate the egos of their donors. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting warm light that seemed to whisper promises of influence and access to those wealthy enough to afford the tuition. Daniel climbed the marble staircase, his footsteps echoing in the space between Gothic arches. Other parents moved through the building with the casual ownership of people who had attended similar institutions themselves. Conversations floated in the air, discussions of summer homes in the Hamptons, prep school applications for children not yet 10 years old, charity galas where attendance was less about philanthropy than social positioning. Room 240 buzzed with the controlled chaos of third graders preparing for dismissal. Miss Henderson, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, stood at the front of the classroom distributing homework folders with the patience of someone who had spent decades managing the children of demanding parents. She looked up as Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Matthews," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "Zoe's been looking forward to your pickup day all week." Zoe Matthews looked up from her desk, where she had been carefully packing her backpack, her face transforming with the pure joy that only children can summon for their parents. At 8, she possessed her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's quick smile. Her school uniform, navy blazer with the St. Bartholomew's crest, white button-down shirt, and plaid skirt, was only slightly rumpled from a day of learning and playground adventures. "Daddy," she called out, rushing toward him with the enthusiasm of someone for whom the world still made perfect sense. Daniel caught her in a hug that felt like coming home after a long journey. This moment, this simple exchange of love between father and daughter, represented everything he worked to protect in his professional life. Justice wasn't an abstract concept when you held your child in your arms. It became personal, urgent, and non-negotiable. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Daniel asked, kneeling to her eye level with the same attention he gave to key witnesses. "We learned about the Constitution in social studies," Zoe said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Miss Henderson said it's like the rules that protect everyone in America. She said your job is to make sure people follow those rules." Daniel smiled, thinking of the irony embedded in his daughter's innocent observation. The Constitution was indeed meant to protect everyone, but Daniel had spent enough years in courtrooms to understand the gap between constitutional promises and constitutional practice. Still, Zoe's faith in the system reminded him why the work mattered. "That's exactly right," he said, standing and taking her small hand in his. "Ready to go home?" They walked together through the hallways, Zoe chattering about her day, while Daniel listened with the focused attention that had made him legendary among defense attorneys and beloved among his staff. Their conversation covered everything from playground politics to her upcoming science project on volcanoes, a topic that had led to extensive research sessions at the kitchen table, complete with baking soda demonstrations that left their kitchen looking like a disaster zone. Outside, the pickup routine continued its choreographed dance. Parents exchanged pleasantries while children compared homework loads and made plans for weekend playdates. The afternoon light had shifted, casting the Gothic spires in golden relief against the cloudless sky. It was the kind of scene that belonged on the cover of a private school brochure, affluent families navigating the comfortable rhythms of privilege. Officer Kane watched Daniel and Zoe emerge from the building with the intensity of a hunter who had just spotted movement in the woods. Something about the interaction bothered him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The man moved through the space with too much familiarity, spoke to the teacher with too much ease, carried himself with too much confidence. Kane's radio crackled again, this time with a call about a minor traffic accident across town. But he ignored it. His attention was focused entirely on Daniel Matthews, who was now walking toward the Mercedes with his daughter skipping beside him. The child seemed comfortable with him, but Kane knew that meant nothing. Criminals were capable of fooling children, especially if they had something to gain. Daniel opened the rear door of the Mercedes and waited while Zoe climbed into her booster seat. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the routine of a man who had performed this same action hundreds of times. He checked her seatbelt with the thoroughness of someone who understood that safety wasn't negotiable, then closed the door with the gentle care of a parent who knew that childhood was both precious and fragile. As Daniel walked around to the driver's side, Kane pushed himself away from his patrol car. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of peaceful Tuesday that usually passed without incident. But something in Kane's gut told him this was different. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, then stopped. He needed more information before calling for backup. The Mercedes started with barely a whisper, its engine purring with the refined power that only German engineering could deliver. Daniel adjusted his rearview mirror, a habit from his law school days when paranoia was a survival skill in a profession where enemies accumulated like legal precedents. In the reflection, he caught sight of Officer Kane approaching with purposeful strides. Daniel frowned slightly, the expression of a man who had learned to read warning signs in courtrooms where careers could be destroyed by misinterpreted gestures. Kane's body language suggested aggression barely held in check, the kind of controlled hostility that Daniel had witnessed from hostile witnesses and opposing counsel who knew their cases were falling apart. "Sir," Kane called out, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone who had learned to command through intimidation rather than respect. "I need you to step out of the vehicle." The pickup area fell silent with the sudden hush that follows unexpected disruption. Other parents turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they recognized the shift in atmosphere. Children pressed their faces against car windows, sensing adult tension without understanding its source. Daniel sat perfectly still for a moment, his hands visible on the steering wheel, in the position recommended by lawyers to clients who might find themselves in similar situations. He had prosecuted enough cases involving police encounters to understand that cooperation was often the difference between a misunderstanding and a tragedy. In the back seat, Zoe looked up from her homework folder with the confusion of a child whose safe world had just tilted off its axis. "Daddy?" she said, her voice small and uncertain. "It's okay, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "Sometimes police officers just need to check things." Daniel opened the door and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. At 6 feet 2 inches, he possessed a natural presence that some found intimidating, but he had learned long ago to make himself appear less threatening in situations where perception mattered more than reality. Kane approached with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, not drawing it, but making sure everyone present understood the implicit threat. In his experience, most people backed down when confronted with authority, especially people who had something to hide. "Is there a problem, officer?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the measured tone he used in court when dealing with hostile witnesses. "I'm just picking up my daughter from school." Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied Daniel's face, looking for signs of deception or guilt. What he saw instead was calm confidence, the kind that usually belonged to people who were accustomed to being in control. This bothered Kane more than outright hostility would have. "Your daughter?" Kane repeated, skepticism dripping from his voice like acid. "You expect me to believe she's your daughter?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its implications spreading through the pickup area with the speed of wildfire. Other parents began moving closer, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that slowed traffic at accident scenes. Some pulled out phones. Whether to record the incident or call for help wasn't immediately clear. Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being reduced to a stereotype, the sensation of watching years of achievement and character dissolve in the face of someone else's prejudices. He had experienced this feeling in courtrooms when opposing counsel tried to undermine his credibility, in restaurants where service suddenly became slow and dismissive, in department stores where security followed him with barely concealed suspicion. "Yes, officer," Daniel said, his voice remaining level despite the fury building in his chest. "Zoe is my daughter. We go through this pickup routine twice a week." Kane circled the Mercedes like a predator assessing prey, his eyes taking in every detail of the vehicle and its occupant. The car was immaculate, recently washed and detailed. The interior leather was pristine, without the wear patterns that might suggest the vehicle was stolen or borrowed. Everything about the scene suggested legitimacy, which only increased Kane's suspicion. In Kane's worldview, criminals had become sophisticated, capable of elaborate deceptions designed to fool honest law enforcement officers. The expensive suit, the luxury car, the comfortable interaction with the child. All of it could be part of an elaborate con game. He had seen drug dealers who drove better cars than police officers, pimps who dressed like investment bankers, thieves who spoke with Ivy League educations. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Kane said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And I'll need you to explain what you're really doing here." Daniel reached slowly for his wallet, telegraphing every movement to avoid any misinterpretation that might escalate the situation. Inside the car, Zoe watched with growing distress as her father was treated like a criminal. Her 8-year-old mind struggled to process the disconnect between her father, the man who read her bedtime stories and helped with math homework, and the threatening situation unfolding outside her window. The wallet was expensive leather, containing the usual array of cards and credentials that marked Daniel as a member of society's professional class. His driver's license was current, his address matching high-end neighborhoods, his photograph clear and recent, but Kane barely glanced at the identification before handing it back with dismissive contempt. "This doesn't answer my question," Kane said, stepping closer to Daniel in a clear attempt at intimidation. "What are you really doing at this school? You planning something? Casing the building? These kids have rich parents, makes them targets for people like you." The accusation hit Daniel like a physical blow, its implications spreading through his consciousness like poison through bloodstream. In a single sentence, Kane had reduced a distinguished career to criminal suspicion, transformed a father's love into predatory threat, and dismissed years of public service as elaborate criminal planning. Around them, the pickup area had become an amphitheater of unwilling witnesses. Parents stood frozen in place, their children pressed against their sides, everyone recognizing that they were watching something terrible unfold, but uncertain how to respond. The afternoon sun continued to shine with cheerful indifference, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the darkness of the moment. Daniel looked back at his daughter, who was now crying silently in the back seat, her tears reflecting the afternoon light like broken crystal. The sight of her distress ignited something primal in his chest, the protective fury of a father watching his child suffer for his own failures to navigate a world that saw his skin color before his character. "Officer," Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm here to pick up my daughter, just like I do every Tuesday and Thursday. If you have concerns about my presence here, perhaps we should speak with the school administration." Kane's face flushed with anger at what he perceived as resistance to his authority. In his experience, innocent people cooperated without question, while guilty people tried to involve lawyers, administrators, or anyone else who might interfere with proper police work. Daniel's suggestion felt like a challenge to Kane's professional competence. "I don't need to speak with anyone," Kane snapped, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "I need you to answer my questions honestly, instead of trying to lawyer your way out of this." The irony of Kane's accusation would have been amusing under different circumstances. Daniel was indeed a lawyer, one of the most prominent prosecutors in the state. But he was also a father, standing in a school pickup line, trying to protect his daughter from witnessing something that would change her understanding of the world forever. As the confrontation continued to escalate, neither Daniel nor Kane could have predicted how this moment would ripple through their lives, transforming a routine Tuesday afternoon into a reckoning that would expose the fault lines running through American society's promise of equal justice under law. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the afternoon sun cast shadows that would soon stretch far beyond the pristine grounds of St. Bartholomew's Academy, reaching into courtrooms, police stations, and the very heart of a system that was about to confront its own contradictions in the most personal way possible. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the pickup area now boiled over into something far more dangerous. Kane's accusation, "What are you really doing at this school?" hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. Daniel Matthews stood perfectly still, his hands still visible, his posture non-threatening, but his mind was racing through legal precedents and constitutional protections that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of Kane's escalating aggression. "Officer Kane," Daniel said, reading the nameplate on the uniform with the same attention to detail that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the state. I understand you're doing your job, but I need you to understand that I'm simply here to pick up my daughter. This is a routine I've followed for 3 years. Kane's face reddened at hearing his name spoken aloud, as if Daniel's knowledge of it represented some kind of threat or challenge to his authority. In Kane's worldview, respect was a one-way street that flowed upward toward badges and uniforms, never downward toward civilians who had forgotten their place in the social hierarchy. "Don't you dare try to get familiar with me," Kane snarled, stepping closer until he was well within Daniel's personal space. "I don't care what routine you think you have. I've been watching you, and something about this whole situation stinks." The pickup area had transformed into an unwilling amphitheater, with luxury vehicles forming a semicircle around the confrontation. Parents who had been discussing weekend tennis matches and charity fundraisers now stood in stunned silence, their children pressed against car windows like spectators at a zoo where the animals had suddenly turned dangerous. The contrast was stark. Privileged families who lived their lives insulated from such confrontations, now witnessing the raw exercise of state power against someone who looked like he didn't belong in their carefully curated world. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, whose family had donated the school's new science wing, stood beside her Range Rover with her mouth agape. She had known Daniel Matthews for 2 years, had served on the parent advisory committee with him, had discussed educational philosophy over catered lunches in the school's boardroom. Yet something in the dynamic unfolding before her made her question whether she should intervene or whether her silence was somehow complicit in what was becoming increasingly obvious as racial profiling. "Should we call someone?" whispered Janet Morrison, clutching her purse like a life preserver. Her son Tommy was in Zoe's class, had been to birthday parties at the Matthews house, had played in their backyard while Janet and Daniel's wife Sarah discussed school curriculum over wine and cheese. The cognitive dissonance of watching a man she knew to be a devoted father and respected professional being treated like a criminal was almost too much to process. Kane circled Daniel's Mercedes like a shark sensing blood in the water, his eyes cataloging every detail of the vehicle's interior. The leather seats were pristine, the dashboard dust-free, the floor mats recently vacuumed. A child's car seat was properly installed in the back, complete with safety features that cost more than Kane made in a month. Everything suggested a legitimate law-abiding family, which only served to increase Kane's suspicion. "Nice car," Kane said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must have cost you plenty. What line of work are you in that lets you afford something like this?" Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The question was loaded with assumptions and implications that revealed far more about Kane's prejudices than about Daniel's legitimacy. In his years as a prosecutor, Daniel had encountered this type of thinking from witnesses and defendants. The inability to conceive that success and respectability could coexist with dark skin. "I work in the legal profession," Daniel replied, choosing his words carefully. Even in this degrading situation, his instincts told him to reveal as little as possible until he understood Kane's intentions. "I've been fortunate in my career." Kane snorted with derision. "Legal profession? What, you some kind of ambulance chaser? Public defender? That would explain the fancy car making money off criminals and degenerates." The irony was so profound that Daniel almost smiled, despite the circumstances. Kane was unknowingly describing the very system that Daniel had spent his career strengthening, the public defense apparatus that ensured constitutional protections for everyone, including police officers who found themselves on the wrong side of internal affairs investigations. "Something like that," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that Kane was too angry to notice. From the Mercedes, Zoe watched her father with growing terror. At 8 years old, she had never seen her daddy treated with anything but respect. Teachers at school spoke to him with deference. Other parents sought his opinion on important matters, and even strangers seemed to recognize something in his bearing that commanded attention. But now he stood before this angry police officer like he had done something wrong, and Zoe couldn't understand why. "Daddy," she called through the window, her voice small and frightened. "What's happening?" Kane's attention snapped to the child, and for a moment something almost human flickered across his face. Then his expression hardened again, as if kindness toward the girl would somehow compromise his authority over her father. "Stay in the car, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice gentle despite the tension radiating through his body. "Everything's going to be okay." But Kane heard only manipulation in Daniel's attempt to comfort his daughter. "Don't talk to her," he barked. "You don't get to give orders here. I'm in charge of this situation." The command struck Daniel like a physical blow. The idea that a police officer could forbid a father from speaking to his own child, from providing comfort during what was clearly a traumatic experience, revealed the depth of Kane's power trip and his fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional rights. Dr. Patricia Chen, the school's headmistress, had been alerted to the commotion by her assistant and now stood at the school's main entrance, watching the scene unfold with growing horror. She had known Daniel Matthews for 3 years, had personally recruited his daughter to the school after meeting him at an education reform conference in Washington. The man being harassed in her parking lot was one of the most prominent legal minds in the state, alumnus of Harvard Law School, and someone whose professional reputation was beyond reproach. "This is absurd," Dr. Chen muttered, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, looking for anyone who could intervene before the situation spiraled completely out of control. But who do you call when the police themselves are the problem? Kane's radio crackled with routine dispatch chatter, but he ignored it completely. His entire focus was trained on Daniel Matthews, whom he had mentally convicted of crimes that existed only in his imagination. The expensive suit was evidence of ill-gotten gains. The luxury car was a tool for criminal enterprise. The comfortable interaction with the private school environment was proof of elaborate deception. "You know what I think?" Kane said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than his previous shouting. "I think you're casing this place. Looking for rich kids to kidnap? Wealthy families to target? That's why you're here with your fancy suit and your stolen car, trying to blend in with decent people." Daniel's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. The accusation was so outrageous, so disconnected from reality, that it took every ounce of his professional training to maintain his composure. "Officer Kane, you're making serious accusations without any evidence whatsoever. I've provided identification. I've explained my presence here. I've cooperated fully with your investigation." "Investigation?" Kane laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "This isn't an investigation. This is me cleaning up the neighborhood, getting rid of people who don't belong." The mask had finally slipped. Kane was no longer pretending to conduct legitimate police work. He was openly admitting to racial profiling, to using his badge as a tool for ethnic cleansing of spaces he deemed too good for people like Daniel Matthews. Around them, more parents had gathered, drawn by the increasingly loud confrontation. Most stood in shocked silence, their phones out, recording every moment of what was becoming increasingly obvious as a gross abuse of power. But their presence seemed only to embolden Kane, who appeared to enjoy having an audience for his performance of authority. "I want you to get back in that car," Kane continued, "and drive away from here. And if I ever see you near this school again, near these children, I'll arrest you for trespassing, stalking, and whatever else I can think of." Daniel felt a surge of righteous anger that threatened to overwhelm his careful self-control. "This is my daughter's school. I have every right to be here. What you're suggesting is illegal intimidation and harassment based solely on my race." Kane's hand moved to his service weapon, not drawing it, but making sure Daniel could see the gesture. "Are you calling me a racist? Are you accusing a police officer of misconduct?" The question was a trap, and Daniel recognized it immediately. Any direct accusation would be twisted into threatening or intimidating a police officer, providing Kane with the pretext he was clearly seeking for escalation. But remaining silent felt like complicity in his own degradation. "I'm stating facts about your behavior," Daniel said carefully. "You've approached me without probable cause, accused me of crimes without evidence, and now you're attempting to exclude me from a public space based on assumptions about my character and intentions." Kane's face flushed with anger. Big words from someone who's about to be arrested for disorderly conduct. "What disorderly conduct?" Daniel asked, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "I've been nothing but cooperative. I've answered your questions. I've provided identification. I've committed no crime, disturbed no peace, threatened no one. You're disturbing the peace right now, Kane shot back, arguing with a police officer, causing a scene in front of children, making these good people uncomfortable with your presence. Daniel looked around at the good people Kane was claiming to protect. He saw Mrs. Thornton, who had hired his wife's catering company for 3 separate school events, Janet Morrison, whose son had slept over at their house just last weekend, Dr. Chen, who had personally recommended Daniel for the school board's legal committee. These weren't strangers being protected from his threatening presence. These were members of his community, watching him be criminalized for existing in a space where he belonged. Officer Kane, Dr. Chen, finally spoke up, stepping forward with the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Mr. Matthews is a valued member of our school community. He's been— Ma'am, I need you to step back, Kane interrupted, his hand moving again toward his weapon. This is police business, and I won't have civilians interfering with my investigation. Investigation of what? Dr. Chen demanded, her voice sharp with indignation. What crime do you suspect Mr. Matthews of committing? Kane's jaw worked silently for a moment, his eyes darting between Daniel, Dr. Chen, and the growing crowd of witnesses. He had painted himself into a corner with his accusations and threats, and now faced the prospect of having to justify his actions to someone who clearly knew his target personally. Trespassing, he said finally. Suspicious behavior, possibly casing the joint for future criminal activity. Trespassing? Dr. Chen's voice rose an octave. He's picking up his daughter. He's done this dozens of times. He's on our approved parent list, for God's sake. The revelation hit Kane like a slap across the face. If Daniel Matthews was on the school's approved parent list, if he had legitimate business being there, then Kane's entire narrative collapsed. But rather than backing down, rather than acknowledging his mistake, Kane doubled down with the desperation of someone whose worldview was being challenged by inconvenient facts. Anyone can fake documents, he said weakly. Anyone can claim to be someone they're not. I've seen elaborate schemes before. Criminals who spend months building fake identities just to gain access to vulnerable targets. Daniel felt something snap inside his chest. The suggestion that his relationship with his own daughter was some kind of elaborate criminal conspiracy, that his love for Zoe was a cover for predatory behavior, crossed a line that no amount of professional restraint could tolerate. That's enough, Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority that had silenced hostile courtrooms and commanded respect from judges, juries, and opposing counsel. You've made your prejudices clear, Officer Kane. You've demonstrated your willingness to abuse your authority based on racial assumptions, and you've shown everyone here exactly what kind of police officer you are. Kane's response was immediate and violent. He grabbed Daniel's arm with unnecessary force, spinning him around and slamming him against the hood of the Mercedes. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and threatening a police officer. I haven't resisted anything, Daniel protested, his voice strained as Kane twisted his arm behind his back. I haven't threatened anyone. This is false arrest. Tell it to the judge. Kane snarled, pulling out his handcuffs with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting all afternoon for this moment. From inside the Mercedes, Zoe's terrified screams pierced the afternoon air like sirens. Daddy! Daddy! Stop hurting my daddy! The sound of his daughter's anguish broke Daniel's heart in ways that Kane's abuse of power never could. This was what he had tried to prevent, the moment when his 8-year-old child learned that her father's achievements, character, and respectability meant nothing when confronted with the kind of systemic racism that he had spent his career fighting. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Daniel Matthews realized that he was about to become a symbol of everything wrong with American policing, and that Officer Bradley Kane had just made the biggest mistake of his career by arresting the one person in the county with the power to ensure that this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. The handcuffs clicked shut around Daniel Matthews's wrists with the cold precision of injustice, the metallic sound echoing across the cobblestone driveway of St. Bartholomew's Academy like a gunshot in a cathedral. The steel bit into his skin as Kane tightened them beyond necessity, each click a declaration of power that resonated through the afternoon air with the finality of a judge's gavel. But these weren't the sounds of justice being served. They were the percussion of a system failing spectacularly, witnessed by dozens of parents and children who would carry this image with them for the rest of their lives. "You have the right to remain silent," Cain recited with mechanical satisfaction, his breath hot against Daniel's ear as he pressed him harder against the Mercedes hood. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The irony was so profound, it was almost surreal. Cain was reading Miranda rights to the man who had helped rewrite the county's Miranda protocols, who had trained police officers on proper arrest procedures, who had prosecuted more constitutional violations than Cain had likely ever investigated. Daniel Matthews knew these rights better than Cain ever would, not just as legal text, but as constitutional principles that protected every American citizen from exactly this kind of abuse. From inside the Mercedes, Zoe's screams had evolved from confusion to pure terror. Her small fists pounded against the window as tears streamed down her face, her voice cracking with the kind of anguish that comes from watching your protector become helpless. "Daddy, Daddy, what are they doing to you? Why are they hurting you?" The sound of his daughter's terror cut through Daniel's professional composure like a knife through silk. This was what he had tried to prevent. The moment when his 8-year-old child learned that her father's achievements, character, and respectability meant nothing when confronted with the kind of systemic racism that he had spent his career fighting. Dr. Chen rushed toward the vehicle, her maternal instincts overriding her shock at what was unfolding. Someone needed to care for this traumatized child while her father was being illegally arrested, and administrative protocol seemed irrelevant in the face of such obvious injustice. "Zoe, sweetheart," Dr. Chen called through the window, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm going to take care of you until your daddy comes back, okay? Can you unlock the door for me?" But Zoe was beyond rational response. Her 8-year-old mind could not process the disconnect between her father, the man who had never raised his voice in anger, who read her bedtime stories with different voices for every character, who helped her with homework, with endless patience, and the scene unfolding before her eyes. Her daddy was being treated like the bad guys she saw on television, and nothing in her sheltered world had prepared her for this reality. Cain forced Daniel away from the Mercedes and toward his patrol car, his grip on Daniel's arm tight enough to leave bruises. Each step across the cobblestone driveway felt like a march toward something irreversible, not just for Daniel, but for everyone watching. The parents who stood frozen in their designer clothes, the children pressed against car windows, the faculty members who had emerged from the school building, all of them were being forced to confront the reality that privilege and respectability offered no protection against the kind of racial bias that Cain embodied. "This is wrong," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice carrying across the pickup area with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. She stepped forward, her phone still recording, her face flushed with indignation. "Officer, this man is a member of our school community. He belongs here. You're making a terrible mistake." Cain paused in his march toward the patrol car, his face contorting with annoyance at this continued interference from civilians who didn't understand their place in the hierarchy of authority. "Ma'am, I've warned you about interfering with police business. If you don't step back, you'll be arrested for obstruction of justice." "Obstruction of justice?" Mrs. Thornton's voice rose to a shout. "The only obstruction of justice here is what you're doing to an innocent man." Other parents began to murmur their agreement, a low rumble of dissent that grew louder as more voices joined in. Janet Morrison stepped forward to stand beside Mrs. Thornton. "She's right. This is insane. Daniel Matthews is one of the most respected parents in this school. He served on the fundraising committee for our new library. His wife, Sarah, organized the charity drive that bought computers for the lower grades." Cain's face darkened at the mention of Daniel's name being spoken with such familiarity by these wealthy white women. In his worldview, their defense of Daniel only confirmed his suspicions about elaborate criminal conspiracies designed to fool decent people. He had seen it before, or thought he had. Criminals who charmed their way into respectable communities, gaining trust that they would eventually exploit. "Ladies, you've been deceived." Kane said with the patronizing tone of someone explaining simple concepts to children. This man has been playing a long game, building relationships, gaining access to your children and your homes. That's how these predators operate. They don't look dangerous, they look respectable. Dr. Chen, who had managed to coax Zoe out of the Mercedes and was now holding the sobbing child in her arms, felt her professional composure finally crack. Officer Kane, you are completely out of line. Mr. Matthews has been a model parent and community member for 3 years. Our background checks are more thorough than most federal security clearances. The accusations you're making are not just wrong, they're slanderous. Kane's response was to increase his grip on Daniel's arm and continue marching toward the patrol car. I've heard enough. This man is going to be processed, and then we'll see what kind of background he really has when we run him through the system properly. Daniel walked with as much dignity as possible, given the circumstances, his mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served him well in courtrooms across the state. He was cataloging every violation of procedure, every constitutional breach, every piece of evidence that would be needed when this case, and there would definitely be a case, went to trial. Kane had provided enough material for a federal civil rights lawsuit that would destroy his career and potentially bankrupt the department. The patrol car sat in the shade of an enormous oak tree that had witnessed over a century of St. Bartholomew's Academy's history. Its black and white paint scheme looked stark and institutional against the Gothic Revival architecture of the school, a reminder that even in the most privileged spaces, the reach of state power could intrude with devastating consequences. Kane opened the rear door of the patrol car with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. The back seat was separated from the front by thick plexiglass, designed to contain criminals and protect officers from dangerous suspects. The irony that Daniel Matthews, a man who had helped design the county's police procedures manual, was about to be caged like a wild animal, was not lost on anyone present. "Watch your head," Kane said, but his guidance was more of a shove than assistance, forcing Daniel into the cramped space with unnecessary roughness. Daniel settled into the hard plastic seat, his handcuffed hands making it impossible to find a comfortable position. The car smelled of disinfectant and fear, the accumulated odor of countless people who had sat in this same spot during the worst moments of their lives. Through the rear window, he could see Zoe still crying in Dr. Chen's arms, her face red and swollen with tears. The sight of his daughter's anguish ignited something primal in Daniel's chest. All his professional training, all his careful restraint, all his strategic thinking about legal consequences, none of it mattered when measured against the trauma that Kane was inflicting on an innocent child. Zoe would remember this moment for the rest of her life, and the psychological scars might never fully heal. Kane slammed the car door with satisfaction, the sound echoing across the pickup area like a judge's gavel, delivering a final verdict. But this wasn't justice. This was the exercise of arbitrary power by someone who had mistaken a uniform for wisdom and a badge for righteousness. As Kane walked around to the driver's side, his radio crackled with a call from dispatch. "Unit 47, what's your status on that suspicious person call at St. Bartholomew's Academy?" Kane grabbed the radio with smug satisfaction. "Unit 47 to dispatch. Suspicious person apprehended and in custody. One adult male arrested for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest and threatening a police officer. En route to station for processing." The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the radio. "Copy that, Unit 47. Nature of the original complaint?" Kane paused for a moment, realizing that he had never actually received a complaint about Daniel Matthews. His entire investigation had been based on his own suspicions and prejudices, not on any reported criminal activity, but admitting that now would expose the illegal nature of his actions, so he improvised. Anonymous tip about suspicious individual casing the school. He lied smoothly. Subject was observed, acting suspiciously around expensive vehicles and showing unusual interest in children. Every word was fabricated, but Kane delivered them with the confidence of someone who had convinced himself that his lies were justified by his instincts. In his mind, the arrest was preventing crimes that would inevitably have occurred if he hadn't intervened. Dr. Chen approached the patrol car with Zoe still in her arms, the child's sobs having subsided into occasional hiccups and sniffles. She tapped on the window, trying to get Daniel's attention. When he looked up, she mouthed the words, "I'll take care of her," and pointed to Zoe. Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and anguish in equal measure. Through the plexiglass and car windows, he could barely hear his daughter's voice, but her words were clear enough. "I want my daddy. When is my daddy coming home?" The question hit Daniel harder than Cain's abuse ever could. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her father has been arrested not for doing anything wrong, but for existing while black in a space where someone with a badge decided he didn't belong? How do you help a child understand that the system designed to protect her had just traumatized her for no reason other than the color of her father's skin? Cain climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting his rearview mirror so he could see Daniel in the back. "Comfortable back there?" he asked with mock concern. "Don't worry, where we're going, you'll have plenty of time to think about your choices." Daniel met Cain's eyes in the mirror, his expression calm, despite the fury building in his chest. "Officer Cain, I hope you understand the magnitude of what you've just done. This arrest will be scrutinized by federal civil rights investigators, internal affairs, and every legal advocacy organization in the state. Your career is over." Cain laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in the sound. "We'll see about that. Where I come from, criminals don't get to threaten police officers and walk away." "I'm not threatening you," Daniel replied quietly. "I'm educating you about the consequences of your actions. There's a difference." The distinction was lost on Cain, who started the patrol car and began the drive toward the police station. As they pulled away from St. Bartholomew's Academy, Daniel took one last look at his daughter through the rear window. Zoe had broken free from Dr. Chen's arms and was running after the patrol car, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could across the cobblestone driveway. "Daddy? Come back, Daddy," she screamed, her voice growing fainter as the distance increased. Dr. Chen caught up to Zoe and scooped her back into her arms, but the damage was done. The image of his daughter chasing after a police car that was taking her father away would haunt Daniel Matthews for years to come, and it would fuel his determination to ensure that Cain faced consequences for what he had done. As the patrol car turned onto the main road, leaving the Gothic spires of St. Bartholomew's Academy behind, Cain felt a surge of professional pride. He had identified a threat, investigated it thoroughly, and removed it from a vulnerable community. In his mind, he was a hero protecting innocent children from a sophisticated predator. But the radio crackled again, and this time, the dispatcher's voice carried a note of urgency. "Unit 47, please confirm the identity of your arrestee. We're getting multiple calls about the incident at St. Bartholomew's Academy." Cain frowned at the radio. Multiple calls seemed excessive for a routine arrest, but sometimes wealthy communities overreacted to minor police activities. "Unit 47 to dispatch. Arrestee is a black male, approximately 40 years old, well-dressed, claims to work in legal profession. No identification verified at scene due to subject's uncooperative behavior." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note that Cain couldn't quite identify. "Unit 47, did you run the subject's identification through the system?" Cain's frown deepened. Standard procedure would have been to verify Daniel's identity before making an arrest. But Cain had been so focused on what he perceived as Daniel's suspicious behavior that he had skipped several basic investigative steps. Negative. Dispatch. Subject was clearly attempting to deceive, so I prioritized public safety over administrative procedures. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Unit 47. What was the subject's name on the identification he provided? Cain felt the first flutter of uncertainty in his chest. He had glanced at Daniel's driver's license, but hadn't really focused on the details. The name had seemed irrelevant compared to what Cain was certain was fraudulent documentation. "Stand by, dispatch," Cain said, pulling Daniel's wallet from his pocket while trying to maintain control of the steering wheel. He flipped it open and looked at the driver's license for the first time with actual attention to detail. The name on the license read, Daniel H. Matthews. The address was in Westfield Heights, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the county. The photograph was clearly recent and matched the man sitting in his back seat. Everything about the identification appeared legitimate, but Kane had seen fake IDs before, and sophisticated criminals could afford sophisticated forgeries. Dispatch. License shows name as Daniel H. Matthews, Westfield Heights address. Documentation appears legitimate, but given the subject's suspicious behavior at an elite private school, I maintain concerns about his true identity and intentions. The silence that followed Kane's transmission stretched longer than any previous pause. When the dispatcher finally responded, her voice carried a tone that made Kane's stomach clench with sudden anxiety. Unit 47, you need to return to station immediately. Do not process the arrestee until you speak with Sergeant Rodriguez. Priority 1. Priority 1 was reserved for emergencies that required immediate command attention. Kane had never received a Priority 1 instruction for a routine arrest, and the implications were beginning to dawn on him with the slow horror of someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Dispatch. Please clarify. Is there additional information about the subject? Unit 47. Return to station now. No further radio traffic on this matter. Kane's hands began to shake slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The dispatcher's refusal to provide information over the radio suggested that whatever she had discovered about Daniel Matthews was sensitive enough to require secure communication. In Kane's experience, that usually meant one of two things. The arrestee was either a federal agent working undercover or someone with enough political connections to make Kane's life very difficult. In the back seat, Daniel sat in silence, watching Kane's growing anxiety, with the calm observation of someone who had seen many guilty people realize the magnitude of their mistakes. He didn't need to hear both sides of the radio conversation to understand what was happening. Someone at the police station had finally bothered to verify his identity, and Kane was about to learn exactly who he had just arrested. The drive to the police station passed in tense silence, broken only by occasional radio chatter and the hum of the patrol car's engine. Kane's confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of fear that comes from realizing you may have just made a career-ending mistake. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Daniel, looking for clues about what kind of person could prompt a Priority 1 response from dispatch. But Daniel's expression revealed nothing. He sat with the calm dignity that had served him well in courtrooms, board meetings, and crisis situations throughout his career. Even handcuffed in the back of a police car, even facing false charges and illegal detention, he maintained the composure that had made him one of the most respected legal minds in the state. As they approached the police station, Kane could see unusual activity in the parking lot. Several supervisors' vehicles were present, including the captain's personal car and what appeared to be an unmarked federal vehicle. The sight made Kane's blood run cold, because federal involvement in a local arrest usually meant that someone very important was very angry about what had just happened. The police station building loomed ahead like a fortress of accountability, its brick facade and barred windows promising that justice would be served, though perhaps not in the way that Kane had originally envisioned. Inside those walls, Daniel Matthews would finally be able to reveal his true identity, and Kane would learn the hard way that some mistakes cannot be undone, some bridges cannot be rebuilt, and some careers cannot be salvaged. As Kane pulled into the station parking lot, his radio crackled one final time. Unit 47, report directly to Captain Morrison's office upon arrival. Do not process your arrestee until further notice. Kane parked the patrol car, with hands that were now visibly shaking, his mind racing through every detail of the arrest, looking for some way to justify his actions when he inevitably faced questioning from his superiors. But deep down, Kane was beginning to understand what Daniel had tried to tell him at the school. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and the consequences were about to unfold with the inexorable force of justice finally, belatedly being served. The police station parking lot felt like a gauntlet of judgment as Kane's patrol car rolled to a stop beside the building's main entrance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the vehicles that shouldn't have been there. Captain Morrison's personal sedan, Lieutenant Harper's unmarked Crown Victoria, and most ominously, a black SUV with federal plates that made Kane's stomach drop like a stone into dark water. Whatever was waiting for him inside the building was bigger than a routine arrest, bigger than departmental discipline, and possibly bigger than his ability to explain away. Kane sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, as if letting go would somehow make the situation more real. Through the rearview mirror, he could see Daniel Matthews sitting with the same calm dignity that had unnerved him at the school. No panic, no pleading, no desperate attempts to negotiate his way out of custody, just patient silence that suggested a man who knew exactly how this was going to end. "Stay put," Kane muttered as he opened the driver's door, though the order was unnecessary. Daniel wasn't going anywhere handcuffed in the back of a locked patrol car, and they both knew it. The walk from the car to the station entrance felt like the longest 20 yards of Kane's career. Each step on the concrete seemed to echo with the weight of impending doom, and when the automatic doors slid open with their familiar pneumatic hiss, Kane felt like he was walking into his own professional funeral. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was waiting just inside the door, her expression unreadable, but her posture radiating the kind of tension that comes from dealing with situations that have already spiraled beyond any hope of quiet resolution. At 45, Rodriguez had seen enough police scandals to recognize the signs of a career-ending disaster, and everything about Kane's body language screamed that he had just provided her with another one. "Kane," she said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who had moved past anger into the cold efficiency of damage control. "Captain Morrison wants to see you immediately. Leave your weapon and radio with Officer Stevens." The instruction to surrender his weapon was like a slap across the face. In Kane's 12 years on the force, he had never been asked to disarm, except during formal internal affairs investigations, the kind that ended with either exoneration or termination, with very little middle ground between the two outcomes. "Sarge, I think there might be some confusion here," Kane began, but Rodriguez cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "No confusion, Officer Kane. Captain Morrison. Now, Officer Stevens will handle your arrestee until this gets sorted out." Officer Stevens, a 23-year veteran, with the kind of weathered face that comes from seeing too much human stupidity, approached with the cautious demeanor of someone who had been briefed on the situation and wanted no part of whatever Kane had stumbled into. "I'll take care of it from here," Stevens said, accepting Kane's service weapon and radio with the grim efficiency of someone disposing of radioactive material. "You better get upstairs before this gets any worse." Kane wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he had simply done his job by removing a suspicious individual from a vulnerable location, but the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on Stevens's face. There was pity there, mixed with the kind of professional distance that cops developed when they watched colleagues destroy their own careers. The elevator ride to the second floor felt like a journey to the executioner's block. Kane watched the floor numbers change on the digital display, 1, 2, and wondered if this would be the last time he made this trip as a sworn police officer. The doors opened with a cheerful ding that seemed wildly inappropriate for the circumstances. Captain Morrison's office sat at the end of a hallway lined with commendations, department photographs, and the accumulated bureaucracy of 3 decades of law enforcement. The door was closed, but Kane could hear voices inside. Multiple voices, some he recognized and others that carried the crisp authority of federal law enforcement. Kane knocked twice, his knuckles barely making contact with the wooden door, before Morrison's voice boomed from inside. "Enter." The office was crowded with people who shouldn't have been there for a routine arrest. Captain Morrison sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from having to explain the unexplainable to people who hold your career in their hands. Lieutenant Harper stood beside the window, her arms crossed, and her expression suggesting that she was already calculating the departmental fallout from whatever Kane had done. But it was the two people in federal suits who made Kane's blood run cold. They stood near the bookshelf, with the predatory stillness of investigators who had already reached their conclusions and were simply waiting for the formalities to play out. Their badges were visible, FBI, and their expressions suggested that Kane had just become the subject of a federal civil rights investigation. "Officer Kane," Captain Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been having very unpleasant conversations for the past hour. "I want you to tell me exactly what happened at St. Bartholomew's Academy this afternoon. Every detail, every word, every decision you made from the moment you arrived until the moment you put someone in handcuffs." Kane felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Despite the office's air conditioning, something about Morrison's phrasing, "someone," instead of the suspect or the arrestee, suggested that Daniel Matthews's identity was no longer a mystery to anyone in the room except Kane himself. "Captain, I responded to suspicious activity at the school," Kane began, falling back on the narrative he had constructed during the drive. "An individual was acting suspiciously around expensive vehicles and showing unusual interest in children. When I approached him for questioning, he became uncooperative and eventually threatening." "Suspicious activity," Morrison repeated slowly, as if testing the words for their weight. "Officer Kane, did you receive a call about suspicious activity at the school?" Kane hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for everyone in the room to notice. "I observed the suspicious activity myself during routine patrol of the area." "I see. And what exactly did this suspicious activity consist of?" Kane's mouth felt dry as he tried to reconstruct his justifications from the school. In this sterile office environment, surrounded by federal investigators and senior officers, his reasons for approaching Daniel Matthews seemed increasingly flimsy. The subject was a black male in an expensive vehicle at an elite private school, Kane said, immediately realizing how that sounded. He appeared to be out of place and was acting in a manner consistent with someone casing the location for future criminal activity. The silence that followed Kane's explanation was deafening. Lieutenant Harper closed her eyes as if she were in physical pain. One of the FBI agents made a note on his pad. Captain Morrison's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested either a stroke or a heart attack was imminent. "Out of place," Morrison said quietly. "Officer Kane, are you telling me that you arrested a man for being black in an expensive car at a private school?" "No, sir," Kane said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "I arrested him for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and threatening a police officer. The suspicious activity was just the initial reason for contact." "The disorderly conduct that consisted of him picking up his daughter from school?" Kane felt the floor shifting beneath his feet. The fact that Morrison knew about the daughter meant that someone had already provided a detailed account of what had actually happened. Probably multiple someones, given the cell phone videos that had been recording every moment of the encounter. "Sir, the subject claimed the child was his daughter, but I had reason to believe he was lying. I've seen elaborate deception schemes before, and criminals have become very sophisticated in their methods of gaining access to potential victims. The expensive car, the expensive suit, the familiarity with the school environment, it all seemed like an elaborate setup designed to fool well-meaning people." "Officer Kane," one of the FBI agents interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of investigating exactly these kinds of civil rights violations. "Are you familiar with the name Daniel Matthews?" Kane blinked, confused by the question. "That's the name on the identification the subject provided." "Yes, sir. But given the circumstances, I believe the documentation might be fraudulent. High-quality fake IDs are readily available, and criminals often invest significant resources in creating convincing false identities." The FBI agent exchanged a glance with his partner before continuing. "Officer Kane, Daniel Matthews is the elected district attorney of this county. He has been for 6 years. His photograph is on the website of every courthouse in the jurisdiction. His signature appears on your department's budget approval documents. His office prosecutes the cases that your arrests generate." The words hit Kane like physical blows, each syllable hammering home the magnitude of his mistake. The room seemed to spin slightly as the implications cascaded through his consciousness like dominoes falling in slow motion. That's impossible," Kane stammered, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. The calm confidence, the expensive suit, the way Daniel had spoken about legal consequences, it all made terrible sense now. "Officer Kane," Captain Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, You have just arrested the chief prosecutor of this county for the crime of picking up his daughter from school. You handcuffed the man who decides whether police officers get prosecuted for misconduct. You traumatized the child of someone who has the power to destroy this entire department." Kane felt his legs go weak. He reached for a chair without permission, sinking into it as the full scope of his career suicide became clear. "I didn't know," he whispered. "How was I supposed to know?" "You were supposed to know," Lieutenant Harper said, speaking for the first time since Kane had entered the room, "because you were supposed to verify his identification before making an arrest. You were supposed to follow basic investigative procedures instead of jumping straight to handcuffs based on racial profiling." "It wasn't racial profiling," Kane protested weakly. "I was responding to suspicious behavior patterns that I've been trained to recognize over 12 years of law enforcement experience. The suspicious behavior of a black man existing in a space where you decided he didn't belong," the second FBI agent said. "Officer Kane, we've already reviewed the cell phone footage from the scene. We've interviewed witnesses. We have a very clear picture of what happened, and it's going to be the centerpiece of a federal civil rights investigation." Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his desk, and his head in his hands. "Kane, do you have any idea what you've done? The district attorney's office handles our prosecutorial recommendations. They approve our overtime requests. They determine which cases get priority attention and which ones get plea bargained down to nothing. You've just declared war on the one person in this county who can make our lives miserable in ways you can't even imagine." Kane wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he had been protecting the community from a perceived threat, but the words stuck in his throat. In the harsh fluorescent light of the captain's office, surrounded by federal investigators and senior officers who were already calculating the damage, his actions at St. Bartholomew's Academy seemed not just wrong, but criminally stupid. "What happens now?" Kane asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Now?" Morrison said. "You're suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation. You'll also be subject to a federal civil rights investigation. The DA's office will almost certainly file charges for false imprisonment, assault under color of authority, and violation of civil rights under federal statute." "And that's just the beginning," Lieutenant Harper added. "The school incident is going to be national news within hours. The department is going to be sued into bankruptcy. Every arrest you've ever made is going to be reviewed for signs of racial bias. Your career is over, Kane. The only question is whether you're going to prison." Kane sat in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that his life had just been destroyed by his own prejudices and poor judgment. 12 years of service, commendations, community connections, all of it was gone because he had looked at a black man picking up his daughter and seen a criminal instead of a father. "I want to see him," Kane said suddenly. "I want to apologize." The FBI agents exchanged another look before the first one spoke. "Officer Kane, you are not to have any contact with District Attorney Matthews. Any attempt to approach him or his family will be considered witness intimidation and will result in immediate federal charges." Morrison stood up from his desk, his movement signaling that the meeting was over. "Turn in your badge and gun to Sergeant Rodriguez. You're on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. And Kane, get yourself a lawyer, a good one, because when the DA's office is done with you, you're going to need all the help you can get." Kane stood on unsteady legs, his mind reeling from the speed with which his world had collapsed. As he walked toward the door, one of the FBI agents called after him. "Officer Kane, one more thing. District Attorney Matthews is still in custody downstairs. He's been handcuffed in the back of a police car and sitting in a processing room for the better part of an hour. You might want to think about that while you're considering the full scope of what you've done here today." Kane stumbled out of the captain's office and down the hallway toward the elevator, his career in ruins, his reputation destroyed, and his future uncertain. Behind him, he could hear the voices of federal investigators and senior officers planning damage control for a scandal that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. As the elevator doors closed, Kane realized that Daniel Matthews had been right about one thing. He had indeed made the biggest mistake of his career. The only question now was whether he would survive the consequences of his own prejudice and poor judgment. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the station's holding area, Daniel Matthews sat in a processing room with his hands still cuffed behind his back, waiting patiently for someone to remember that the county's chief prosecutor was being held illegally in his own jurisdiction's jail. The irony was not lost on him that he was about to become both the victim and the prosecutor in what would undoubtedly become one of the most high-profile civil rights cases in the county's history. The processing room in the basement of the police station smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made everything look slightly surreal. Daniel Matthews sat in a metal chair that had been bolted to the floor, his hands still cuffed behind his back, despite the fact that he posed no threat to anyone except Officer Kane's career prospects. The room was designed to intimidate. Bare walls, no windows, a one-way mirror that reflected his own image back at him like an accusation. For the past hour and 20 minutes, Daniel had waited with the patience of someone who understood that bureaucratic machinery moved slowly, especially when that machinery was trying to figure out how to extract itself from a catastrophic mistake. He could hear voices in the hallway outside, urgent conversations, heated exchanges, the sound of people trying to solve a problem that had no easy solution. Officer Stevens finally entered the room, his face flushed with embarrassment and his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with a keyring. At 51, Stevens had seen enough departmental scandals to recognize when he was participating in one, and everything about his body language suggested that he wanted this particular shift to end as quickly as possible. "Mr. Matthews," Stevens said, his voice carrying the kind of formal respect that came from suddenly realizing you were dealing with someone far above your pay grade. "I'm going to remove your handcuffs now. I want to apologize for the delay in processing. There have been some administrative complications." Daniel remained perfectly still while Stevens unlocked the handcuffs, though he couldn't suppress a slight wince as circulation returned to his hands. The metal had left red marks on his wrists, evidence that would probably appear in federal court photographs alongside testimony about excessive force and constitutional violations. "Thank you, Officer Stevens," Daniel said, massaging his wrists gently. "I appreciate your professionalism in this situation." Stevens looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock. "Sir, you're entitled to make a phone call. I can take you to the phone now if you'd like." Daniel nodded, standing slowly and straightening his suit jacket. Despite everything that had happened, the arrest, the handcuffs, the hour of detention, he still carried himself with the dignity that had made him one of the most respected prosecutors in the state. The phone sat on a metal shelf in an alcove just outside the processing room, its receiver scarred by years of desperate conversations between arrestees and the people they hoped would rescue them. Daniel picked up the handset and dialed a number he knew by heart, his finger moving across the buttons with the precision of muscle memory. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "District Attorney's Office. This is Patricia." Patricia Hernandez had been Daniel's executive assistant for 4 years, and in that time she had developed the kind of protective instincts that made her invaluable to someone whose job required managing multiple crises simultaneously. Her voice carried the calm efficiency of someone who had handled everything from death threats to media scandals without breaking stride. "Patricia, it's Daniel," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening to his conversation. "Daniel, thank God. We've been getting calls about some kind of incident at Zoe's school. Channel 7 News called asking for a statement about a confrontation with police. What's going on?" Daniel took a deep breath, preparing to explain a situation that would sound insane, even to someone who knew him well. "Patricia, I'm calling you from the county jail. I've been arrested." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Patricia's voice returned, higher and more strained than before. "You've been what? That's not possible. Where are you really calling from?" "I'm in the basement of the police station on Maple Street," Daniel said patiently. "Officer Bradley Kane arrested me at St. Bartholomew's Academy approximately 2 hours ago. I'm being held on charges of disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and threatening a police officer." "That's insane," Patricia said, her voice rising. "What do they think you did?" "Kane apparently believed I was casing the school for criminal purposes. He arrested me for picking up Zoe." Patricia's gasp was audible through the phone. "Where's Zoe? Is she okay?" Dr. Chen is taking care of her. But Patricia, I need you to listen carefully. This is going to be a major incident. The media is probably already sniffing around, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. I need you to contact Attorney General Morrison and brief her on the situation. I also need you to call Mayor Thompson and give him a heads up that his police department just created a federal civil rights incident. Daniel, this is unbelievable. A police officer arrested the district attorney? How is that even possible? Racial profiling. Daniel said simply, Kane saw a black man in an expensive car at an elite private school and decided I was a criminal. He never bothered to verify my credentials or listen to explanations from school staff who know me. Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. This is going to be huge, isn't it? Enormous. And Patricia, I need you to start preparing for the aftermath. Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week. Draft a press statement about the incident, but don't release it until we talk. And call my wife. Sarah needs to hear about this from us before she sees it on the news. I'll handle everything, Patricia said, her voice returning to its normal, efficient tone. But Daniel, are you sure you're okay? Do you need medical attention? A lawyer? Daniel almost smiled at the suggestion that the county's chief prosecutor might need legal representation. I'm fine, Patricia, and I suspect I won't need a lawyer for long. The department is probably trying to figure out how to make this go away without admitting liability. Sir. Officer Stevens appeared beside Daniel, his face pale and his voice apologetic. Captain Morrison would like to speak with you. Daniel covered the phone's mouthpiece. Tell Captain Morrison I'll be happy to discuss this situation once I'm properly released from custody. Stevens nodded and disappeared down the hallway, probably relieved to have something concrete to report to his superiors. Patricia, Daniel continued, I need to go. They're apparently ready to start the damage control process, but keep me informed about any media calls or political reactions. This is going to be a learning experience for everyone involved. I'll take care of everything on this end, Patricia assured him. And Daniel, I'm sorry this happened to you. It's wrong on every level. Daniel hung up the phone and stood in the alcove for a moment, listening to the sounds of the police station around him. Phones ringing, radios crackling, the distant sound of someone typing reports, all the routine noises of law enforcement going about its business while trying to pretend that one of its officers hadn't just committed career suicide in front of dozens of witnesses. Stevens reappeared, this time accompanied by Sergeant Rodriguez, whose expression suggested that she had drawn the short straw for handling the most embarrassing situation in the department's recent history. Mr. Matthews, Rodriguez said, her voice carefully neutral, we're going to release you immediately. Captain Morrison wants to meet with you to discuss this situation, but we understand if you prefer to handle this through other channels. Daniel considered the offer for a moment. Part of him wanted to meet with Morrison face to face, to see the man squirm while trying to explain how his department had managed to arrest the county's chief prosecutor. But another part of him knew that anything he said now could complicate the inevitable federal investigation. Sergeant Rodriguez, Daniel said finally, I appreciate Captain Morrison's desire to discuss this situation, but I think it would be inappropriate for me to participate in any informal resolution while I'm still officially under arrest. Perhaps we should handle this through proper channels. Rodriguez nodded, clearly relieved that she wouldn't have to facilitate what would undoubtedly have been an extremely awkward conversation. Of course, sir. Let me get your personal effects and we'll have you out of here as quickly as possible. The process of retrieving his wallet, watch, and car keys from the property room took another 15 minutes, 15 more minutes of illegal detention that would be added to the growing list of constitutional violations that Kane had committed. Daniel signed the property receipt with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to legal documents, knowing that every piece of paper generated by this incident would eventually be scrutinized by federal investigators. As they walked toward the station's main exit, Rodriguez cleared her throat nervously. Mr. Matthews, I want you to know that what happened today doesn't represent the values or training of this department. Officer Kane acted outside policy and procedure, and there will be consequences. Daniel stopped walking and turned to face Rodriguez directly. Sergeant, I appreciate your sentiment, but let's be clear about something. Officer Kane didn't act outside your training. He acted exactly according to biases that your department has apparently failed to address. This wasn't an aberration. This was a predictable result of attitudes and practices that have been allowed to persist. Rodriguez's face flushed, but she nodded. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right. The question now, Daniel continued, is whether your department is going to use this incident as an opportunity for real reform, or whether you're going to treat it as a public relations problem that needs to be managed. Sir, I can assure you that Captain Morrison and Chief Williams are committed to a thorough review of our policies and procedures. Daniel smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in the expression. Sergeant, in 6 years as district attorney, I've heard a lot of promises about thorough reviews. I'm more interested in seeing actual changes. They reached the main entrance of the police station, where late afternoon sunlight streamed through glass doors that had never looked more welcoming. Daniel could see his Mercedes in the parking lot, still sitting exactly where Kane had demanded he leave it at the school. Another small piece of evidence in what was becoming a very large federal case. Mr. Matthews, Rodriguez said as they reached the door. Is there anything else we can do for you? Do you need transportation? Medical attention? I need my daughter, Daniel said simply, and I need to go home and explain to her why her father was treated like a criminal for picking her up from school. Rodriguez had no answer for that, so she simply opened the door and stepped aside. Daniel walked out of the police station and into the afternoon sunlight. A free man who had just experienced the criminal justice system from the other side. Behind him, the building buzzed with activity as officers, supervisors, and federal investigators tried to piece together how a routine school pickup had turned into a national civil rights incident. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chin. Zoe is safe with me. We're in my office. Come when you're ready. Daniel typed back quickly, on my way. Thank you for taking care of her. As he walked toward his Mercedes, Daniel could see news vans beginning to arrive in the parking lot. Channel 7 was already setting up cameras, and he could spot reporters from at least 2 other local stations. The story was breaking, and within hours it would be national news. But Daniel's immediate concern wasn't the media circus that was about to erupt. His priority was getting back to his daughter, holding her close, and somehow explaining how the system that was supposed to protect them had failed so spectacularly. As he started the Mercedes and pulled out of the police station parking lot, Daniel Matthews began planning not just his own recovery from this traumatic afternoon, but the systematic reform of a police department that had just learned the hard way that accountability was no longer optional. The phone call to Patricia had been just the beginning. Now the real work would start. The work of turning a personal injustice into institutional change, and ensuring that no other father would face the choice between protecting his dignity and protecting his child from witnessing state-sanctioned humiliation. Justice would be served, but it would take more than apologies and promises. It would take the kind of sustained legal and political pressure that only someone with Daniel's resources and connections could bring to bear. Officer Kane had awakened a sleeping giant, and the consequences would reshape law enforcement in the county for years to come. The first domino fell at exactly 4:47 p.m. when Patricia Hernandez hung up the phone after speaking with Daniel and immediately dialed the direct line to Attorney General Morrison's office. Her hands were shaking slightly as she waited for the connection, the magnitude of what she was about to report settling into her consciousness like ice water in her veins. In her 4 years as Daniel's executive assistant, she had handled everything from death threats to political scandals, but nothing had prepared her for the surreal task of informing the state's highest law enforcement official that the county's chief prosecutor had been arrested for the crime of being black while picking up his daughter from school. The phone in Attorney General Morrison's office rang with the crisp electronic tone that suggested important business, and Patricia found herself holding her breath as she waited for someone to answer. She could hear the sounds of the district attorney's office around her, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of prosecutors discussing cases, all the routine noises of justice being administered that now seemed somehow inappropriate given the circumstances. Attorney General Morrison's office. This is Jennifer. Jennifer Walsh had been Morrison's gatekeeper for 8 years, and her voice carried the kind of professional authority that came from protecting one of the most powerful people in the state from unnecessary interruptions. Patricia had spoken with her dozens of times over the years, usually about scheduling meetings or coordinating press conferences, but never about anything approaching this level of urgency. "Jennifer, this is Patricia Hernandez from the District Attorney's Office. I need to speak with the Attorney General immediately. It's urgent." "She's in a meeting with the governor about the budget proposal," Jennifer replied with the kind of polite firmness that suggested interrupting budget discussions would require a very compelling reason. "Can I take a message?" Patricia closed her eyes, knowing that what she was about to say would interrupt budget discussions, probably ruin several people's afternoons, and potentially change the trajectory of multiple political careers. The words felt surreal, even as she prepared to speak them, as if she were participating in some kind of elaborate practical joke that had gotten wildly out of hand. "Jennifer, District Attorney Matthews has been arrested by local police. The Attorney General needs to know about this right now." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Patricia to wonder if the call had been disconnected, but not long enough for her to convince herself that she had imagined the conversation. When Jennifer's voice returned, it was higher and more strained, carrying the kind of incredulity that comes from hearing something that contradicts fundamental assumptions about how the world works. "I'm sorry, did you say arrested? As in handcuffs and jail?" "Yes, for picking up his daughter from school. Officer Bradley Kane of the county police decided that a black man in an expensive car at an elite private school looked suspicious. I need the Attorney General on the phone within the next 5 minutes, or this is going to be on the evening news before she knows it happened." Jennifer didn't waste time with further questions or expressions of disbelief. "Hold on." While Patricia waited, she pulled up the contact list on her computer and began making a mental inventory of all the people who needed to be notified before they learned about this from social media, evening news broadcasts, or angry phone calls from federal investigators. Mayor Thompson, Police Chief Williams, the chairman of the school board, Daniel's wife Sarah, the chairman of the county commissioners, several state legislators who had close working relationships with Daniel, and at least a dozen other political figures who would want to distance themselves from this disaster as quickly as possible, while simultaneously calculating how they could use it to their advantage. The contact list seemed to grow longer the more she thought about it. Every prosecutor in the office would need to know, because their working relationships with the police department had just been fundamentally altered. Defense attorneys would need to be informed, because every case involving Officer Kane was now potentially compromised. Judges would want to know, because they would soon be dealing with motions to dismiss cases based on Kane's credibility issues. The ripple effects were going to spread through the entire criminal justice system like cracks through broken glass. "Patricia?" Attorney General Morrison's voice came through the phone, with the kind of controlled urgency that comes from years of managing political crises that could destroy careers or derail legislative agendas. Morrison had built her reputation on handling difficult situations with grace and intelligence, but the strain in her voice suggested that even she was struggling to process what Jennifer had just told her. "It's true, ma'am. Officer Bradley Kane of the county police arrested District Attorney Matthews at St. Bartholomew's Academy approximately 2.5 hours ago. Daniel was picking up his daughter Zoe when Kane decided he looked suspicious. Kane handcuffed him in front of his child and took him to jail on fabricated charges." Patricia could hear papers rustling in the background and the sound of a door closing as Morrison moved to a private space where she could speak freely without worrying about who might overhear a conversation about one of the most explosive political scandals in the state's recent history. "Patricia, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail you know. Don't leave anything out, no matter how minor it seems." Patricia recounted Daniel's brief explanation from the jail, adding details about the media calls that had already started coming in and the obvious racial profiling that seemed to be at the heart of Kane's decision to arrest a man for the crime of existing while black in an affluent space. With each sentence, the silence on Morrison's end grew more profound and more ominous, until Patricia began to wonder if the call had been disconnected or if Morrison was simply too shocked to respond. "My God," Morrison finally said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just realized that her afternoon had become infinitely more complicated. "Patricia, this is going to be a national story within hours. The arrest of a sitting district attorney on racial profiling charges? Every civil rights organization in the country is going to be calling for investigations. The Justice Department is going to want answers. This is going to be on CNN and MSNBC before dinner time." "Daniel asked me to brief you before the story breaks," Patricia said. "He also wanted you to know that he's handling this through proper legal channels, not trying to make it go away quietly. He's treating this as a criminal matter and a civil rights violation." Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of Daniel's decision to handle the incident formally, rather than seeking some kind of backroom resolution that might minimize the political fallout. In many ways, a formal approach would create more problems for everyone involved, but it was also the only approach that had any hope of addressing the underlying issues that had made the incident possible. "He's absolutely right to handle it formally," Morrison said finally. "Any attempt to sweep this under the rug would make it 10 times worse when it inevitably came to light. And it would come to light there are too many witnesses and too much video footage for this to stay quiet. Patricia, I'm going to make some calls. Keep me informed of any new developments and make sure Daniel knows that he has the full support of this office." The second domino fell exactly 3 minutes later, when Mayor Thompson's assistant transferred Patricia's call directly to the mayor's personal cell phone. Thompson was at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center, smiling for photographers and making small talk with local business leaders about property tax assessments and municipal bond issues, when his phone rang with news that would destroy not just the rest of his week, but potentially his entire political career. The community center was a pet project that Thompson had championed for 2 years, fighting through budget battles and zoning disputes to create what he hoped would be a centerpiece of his legacy as mayor. The afternoon had been perfect. Sunny weather, good turnout, positive media coverage, and the kind of feel-good municipal accomplishment that made re-election campaigns much easier. Thompson was genuinely enjoying himself, basking in the glow of civic achievement and the warm appreciation of constituents who were seeing tangible benefits from their tax dollars. "Mr. Mayor," his assistant's voice came through his earpiece with unusual urgency. "Patricia Hernandez from the DA's office is on the line. She says it's extremely urgent." Thompson excused himself from a conversation with the president of the Chamber of Commerce and walked toward his car, assuming that Patricia was calling about some routine administrative matter that couldn't wait until tomorrow. Perhaps Daniel needed his signature on some budget authorization, or maybe there was a scheduling conflict for an upcoming joint press conference about crime statistics. "Patricia, what's so urgent that it couldn't wait until tomorrow?" "Mr. Mayor, your police department just arrested District Attorney Matthews." Thompson stopped walking so abruptly that the photographer behind him bumped into his back, nearly knocking both of them to the ground. The mayor's security detail immediately moved closer, reading his body language as a sign of potential threat, while Thompson tried to process what Patricia had just told him. "That's not funny, Patricia. I'm at a public event with media present. This isn't the time for jokes." "It's not a joke, sir. Officer Bradley Kane arrested him at his daughter's school about 3 hours ago. Racial profiling. The media is already calling for statements, and this is going to be national news within hours." Thompson excused himself from the crowd of community leaders and local officials, walking quickly toward his car while his mind raced through the political implications of having his police force arrest the county's chief prosecutor. He could already see the headlines, the cable news segments, the social media outrage that would dominate the next news cycle and probably several news cycles after that. "How bad is this going to be?" Thompson asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "National news, sir. Federal civil rights investigation. Probably lawsuits that could bankrupt the city. Congressional hearings. Justice Department oversight. And that's just the beginning," Patricia replied, with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from delivering very bad news to people who don't want to hear it. Thompson reached his car and sat down heavily in the driver's seat, his earlier euphoria about the community center ribbon cutting evaporating like morning mist in the face of what was clearly going to be the worst crisis of his political career. In 30 years of politics, he had navigated budget crises, corruption scandals, natural disasters, and labor disputes, but this was different. This was the kind of incident that ended political careers, destroyed municipal budgets, and left cities under federal oversight for decades. "What does Matthews want?" Thompson asked, hoping that there might be some way to contain the damage through negotiation or compromise. "He's not negotiating, sir. He's treating this as a criminal matter and a civil rights violation. No backroom deals, no quiet settlements, no political favors. This is going to court, and it's going to be very public." Thompson closed his eyes and tried to calculate how much this was going to cost the city in legal fees, settlement payments, federal oversight, and lost business investment. The preliminary numbers made him feel physically sick, but the long-term implications were even worse. Cities that became associated with high-profile civil rights violations often spent decades rebuilding their reputations and their economies. The third domino fell when Police Chief Williams was pulled out of a department budget meeting to take an urgent call from Captain Morrison. Williams had been reviewing overtime expenses and equipment requests with his senior staff, the routine administrative work that kept a police department functioning effectively within its allocated resources, when his assistant knocked on the conference room door with an expression that suggested the building was literally on fire. The budget meeting had been going well. Overtime costs were down from the previous year, community satisfaction ratings were up, and the department was on track to complete several important equipment upgrades ahead of schedule. Williams had been looking forward to presenting these positive numbers to the City Council at their next meeting, using them as justification for increased funding for community policing initiatives that he believed were essential for maintaining good relationships between officers and residents. "Chief, Captain Morrison needs to speak with you immediately," his assistant said, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "He says it's about a federal incident." Williams excused himself from the meeting and walked to his office, wondering what kind of federal incident could have occurred on what had been, until this moment, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Federal incidents usually involved either terrorism, major drug trafficking, or civil rights violations, and he couldn't think of any ongoing investigations that might have escalated to federal attention. He picked up his desk phone and dialed Morrison's extension, expecting to hear about some routine coordination with federal agencies, or perhaps a request for assistance with a multi-jurisdictional investigation. "Captain, what's this? About a federal incident?" Morrison's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a very deep well, filtered through layers of shock and professional dread. "Chief, we have a situation. Officer Kane arrested someone this afternoon, and it's turned into a federal civil rights case." Williams frowned, trying to remember if Kane had mentioned any unusual arrests during his shift. Kane was generally a solid officer with good instincts and a clean record, though he could sometimes be overly aggressive in situations that called for more diplomatic approaches. "Kane? He's usually pretty solid. What happened? Did someone get hurt during an arrest?" "He arrested District Attorney Matthews." The words hit Williams like a physical blow, causing him to drop into his chair as if someone had cut his legs out from under him. In 25 years of law enforcement, spanning everything from street patrol to federal task force work, he had never heard of anything approaching this level of institutional catastrophe. "Please tell me you're joking. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding that's going to be cleared up with a few phone calls and some paperwork." "I wish I was joking, Chief." Kane arrested the DA for picking up his daughter from school, racial profiling. "It's already been reported to the FBI. There are news trucks in our parking lot, and the Attorney General's office is asking for a full report within the hour." Williams put his head in his hands and tried to process what Morrison had just told him. The implications were staggering, not just for Kane, whose career was obviously over, but for the entire department. Every case involving Kane would be reviewed. Every arrest he had made would be questioned. Every conviction based on his testimony would be appealed. The department's credibility with prosecutors, judges, and the community would be destroyed. "Where's Kane now?" "Suspended. Turned in his badge and gun about an hour ago. The FBI wants to interview him, and the DA's office is probably preparing criminal charges as we speak." Williams stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the parking lot where he could see news vans setting up satellite equipment and reporters preparing for live broadcasts. The sight made his stomach clench with the kind of dread that comes from watching your life's work collapse in real time. How bad is this going to get? Chief, this is career-ending bad. For Kane, for the department, possibly for anyone who tries to defend what happened. The videos from the scene are already going viral on social media, and civil rights organizations are calling for Justice Department investigations. The fourth domino fell at St. Bartholomew's Academy, where Dr. Chen was trying to comfort a traumatized 8-year-old while fielding increasingly frantic calls from board members, parents, local media outlets, and concerned community leaders who had heard rumors about some kind of incident during afternoon pickup. Zoe sat in an oversized leather chair beside Dr. Chen's desk, clutching a worn teddy bear from the school's lost and found box, her eyes red from crying but her tears finally subsiding into occasional sniffles and hiccups. The headmistress's office was designed to project authority and tradition, with oil paintings of previous headmasters gazing down from wood-paneled walls and Persian rugs covering polished hardwood floors. Under normal circumstances, it was a space that conveyed stability and institutional confidence, but today it felt like a bunker where Dr. Chen was trying to protect both a traumatized child and the school's reputation from forces that seemed increasingly beyond her control. "Zoe, sweetheart," Dr. Chen said gently, kneeling beside the chair so that she could look directly into the child's eyes. "Your daddy is going to be here soon. He's okay, and he's coming to take you home. Sometimes grown-ups make very big mistakes, but that doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen to you or your family." Zoe looked up with the kind of profound confusion that comes from watching the adult world reveal its fundamental unfairness in the most personal way possible. "Why did they take my daddy away? He didn't do anything bad. He never does anything bad." Dr. Chen struggled to find words that would make sense to a child whose understanding of justice and fairness had just been shattered by witnessing her father treated like a criminal. How do you explain racial profiling to an 8-year-old? How do you help a child understand that some adults make decisions based on prejudice rather than evidence? "Sometimes people make decisions based on things that aren't fair," Dr. Chen said carefully. "Your daddy didn't do anything wrong. The police officer made a mistake, a very big mistake, and now other people are going to make sure that mistake gets fixed." The phone on Dr. Chen's desk rang for what felt like the 100th time in the past hour. This time, it was Bradley Whitman, chairman of the school board, his voice tight with the kind of panic that comes from realizing you're suddenly associated with a national scandal that could destroy everything you've worked to build. "Patricia, I just got a call from Channel 7 News asking for a statement about a police incident involving one of our parents." The reporter knew specific details about handcuffs and arrests. "What the hell happened in our parking lot?" Dr. Chen glanced at Zoe and modulated her voice carefully, trying to discuss the crisis without further traumatizing the child who was at the center of it. "Bradley, Daniel Matthews was arrested in our pickup area this afternoon. Officer Kane apparently decided that a black father picking up his daughter looked suspicious." "Daniel Matthews? The district attorney? The man who donated money for our new library? The one whose wife organized the charity drive that bought computers for the lower grades? That's impossible." "I watched it happen, Bradley. I stood 15 feet away while Kane handcuffed one of our most respected parents and took him away while his daughter screamed for her daddy. It was the most appalling thing I've ever witnessed in 30 years of education." Whitman was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating the financial and reputational damage that was about to be visited upon the school. "This is going to destroy us, isn't it? Parents are going to pull their kids out. Donors are going to run away. The board is going to demand resignations. Bradley, we need to focus on doing the right thing here." Dr. Chen said firmly, "Daniel Matthews is a respected member of our community who was humiliated and traumatized in front of his child. Our response needs to reflect our values and our commitment to justice, not our public relations concerns." What about the other parents who witnessed this? Are they talking to the media? Are they blaming the school? Dr. Chen looked out her window toward the parking area where the incident had occurred. Several parents had lingered after pickup, talking in small groups with animated gestures and occasionally pointing toward the spot where Daniel had been arrested. Their body language suggested outrage and solidarity, rather than blame directed at the school. The parents are horrified, Bradley. Mrs. Thornton and Janet Morrison have been calling me all afternoon wanting to know what they can do to help Daniel and Zoe. Everyone who witnessed this knows it was wrong, and they're looking for ways to support the family. The fifth domino fell in the district attorney's office itself, where deputy prosecutors and support staff were trying to process the information that their boss, the man they looked to for leadership and guidance in navigating the complex world of criminal justice, had been arrested by the very police department they worked with daily. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez had been reviewing case files in his office, preparing for tomorrow's arraignments and plea negotiations, when Patricia's assistant knocked on his door with news that seemed too bizarre to be credible. "Michael, Patricia wants to see you immediately. She says there's been a serious incident involving DA Matthews, and she needs to brief all senior staff right away." Rodriguez walked to Patricia's office with the casual concern of someone expecting to hear about a minor traffic accident, a scheduling conflict, or perhaps some kind of administrative problem that would require reshuffling court appearances. He was not prepared for Patricia's grim expression, the urgency in her voice, or the stack of phone messages on her desk that suggested the entire office was about to be thrown into chaos. "Michael, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but it's true. Daniel has been arrested." Rodriguez laughed despite himself, assuming that Patricia was making some kind of joke about the pressures of prosecutorial work, or the irony of law enforcement officers who sometimes found themselves on the wrong side of the legal system. "That's a good one, Patricia. What really happened? Did he get a parking ticket?" "I'm completely serious, Michael. Officer Bradley Kane arrested him at Zoe's school this afternoon. Racial profiling, handcuffs, jail cell, the whole thing. He's been released, but this is going to be the biggest story in the state." Rodriguez's smile faded as he realized Patricia wasn't joking, and the full implications of what she had just told him began to sink in. "This is going to completely destroy our working relationship with the police department." "It's going to do much more than that, Michael. Every case Daniel has prosecuted involving Kane's testimony is going to be reviewed for potential bias. Every conviction could be overturned if Kane's credibility is deemed compromised. We're looking at years of legal chaos and hundreds of cases that might need to be retried." Rodriguez ran his hands through his hair as the implications became clearer and more frightening. "We prosecute police misconduct cases. How do we handle this when our own DA is the victim? Do we recuse ourselves? Do we hand everything over to the state? What about ongoing investigations involving other officers? We recuse ourselves from anything involving Kane and let the state attorney general handle it. But Michael, this goes far beyond just the criminal case against Kane. The department's budget requests come through our office. Their overtime authorizations need our approval. We coordinate with them on hundreds of cases every year. We're going to have to work with people who just arrested our boss for being black in the wrong neighborhood." The cascade was accelerating, now spreading through the interconnected web of relationships, institutions, and power structures that made local government function. Every phone call generated 2 or 3 additional calls. Every person who learned about the incident felt compelled to warn someone else, to seek guidance, to calculate how the crisis might affect their own interests. The story was metastasizing through the political and social networks of the county, like a virus specifically designed to destroy careers, institutions, and assumptions about how justice was supposed to work in America. The Mercedes moved through the late afternoon traffic with the quiet precision of German engineering, but Daniel Matthews drove with the hypervigilant awareness of someone whose faith in the predictability of the world had just been shattered. Every police car he passed, every siren in the distance, every uniformed officer visible on street corners seemed to carry new significance now that he understood how quickly the protection of law could transform into the persecution of prejudice. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the controlled tension of a man who had just learned that his achievements, his reputation, and his character meant nothing when viewed through the lens of someone else's racial bias. The drive from the police station back to St. Bartholomew's Academy took 12 minutes, but it felt like a journey between 2 different worlds. Behind him lay the concrete and steel reality of the criminal justice system. Booking rooms and holding cells, federal investigators and internal affairs protocols, the grinding machinery of accountability that would slowly but inexorably destroy Officer Kane's career, while attempting to restore some measure of justice to an obviously unjust situation. Ahead of him lay his daughter, waiting in the headmistress's office with the kind of patient confusion that only children can maintain when the adult world reveals its fundamental contradictions. Daniel's phone buzzed constantly with incoming calls and text messages, reporters seeking statements, colleagues expressing outrage and support, political figures calculating how this incident might affect their own interests. He ignored them all. Nothing mattered except getting back to Zoe, holding her close, and beginning the long process of explaining how a routine school pickup had become a national symbol of everything wrong with American policing. The Gothic spires of St. Bartholomew's Academy came into view like familiar landmarks in an unfamiliar country. The school looked exactly as it had 3 hours earlier. Pristine grounds, ivy-covered walls, the comfortable prosperity that marked it as one of the most elite educational institutions in the state. But Daniel knew that the appearance of normalcy was illusory. The school would forever be associated with the image of a black father being handcuffed while his daughter screamed from the back seat of a Mercedes, and no amount of damage control could erase that association. News vans lined the street outside the school's main entrance. Their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers, turning toward the sun of public attention. Reporters stood in small clusters, checking their phones and adjusting their makeup, while camera operators tested equipment and sound engineers checked audio levels. The scene had the organized chaos of a major news event, complete with the kind of urgent energy that accompanies stories with national implications. Daniel parked in the faculty lot, behind the main building, using his knowledge of the school's layout to avoid the media circus that was already forming at the main entrance. As he walked toward the administrative building, he could see parents arriving to pick up children from after-school programs, their conversations animated, and their body language suggesting that news of the afternoon's incident had already spread throughout the school community. Mrs. Thornton spotted Daniel first, breaking away from a group of parents near the tennis courts to intercept him before he reached the building. Her face was flushed with indignation, and her voice carried the kind of righteous anger that comes from witnessing injustice perpetrated against someone you know and respect. "Daniel," she called, hurrying across the parking lot with the determined stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "My God, what they did to you was unconscionable. Absolutely unconscionable. I've been calling everyone I know, board members, city council, the mayor's office. This cannot stand." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face Mrs. Thornton, grateful for her support, but also acutely aware that their conversation was probably being observed by reporters with telephoto lenses and directional microphones. "Elizabeth, I appreciate your concern. It's been a difficult afternoon." "Difficult?" Mrs. Thornton's voice rose to a level that could probably be heard across the parking lot. "Daniel, they arrested you for picking up your daughter in front of Zoe, in front of all of us. That officer should be fired, prosecuted, and banned from ever wearing a badge again." Other parents began to gather around them, drawn by Mrs. Thornton's raised voice and the magnetic pull of being close to the center of a major news story. Janet Morrison approached with her son Tommy, who had been in Zoe's class since kindergarten and had attended birthday parties at the Matthews house. "Daniel, we're so sorry," Janet said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tommy keeps asking why the police took Zoe's daddy away. I don't know how to explain it to him." Daniel knelt down to Tommy's eye level, his instincts as a father overriding his desire to get inside the building and away from potential media attention. "Hi, Tommy. Sometimes adults make mistakes, really big mistakes, but Zoe and I are going to be okay, and we're going to make sure that what happened today doesn't happen to other families." Tommy nodded with the solemn understanding of a child who sensed that something important was happening, even if he couldn't fully comprehend its implications. "Is Zoe sad?" "She's been scared," Daniel admitted, "but she's going to feel better when I take her home." Dr. Chen appeared at the entrance to the administrative building, her professional composure intact, but her eyes reflecting the strain of managing a crisis that had no precedent in the school's century-long history. She gestured toward Daniel with subtle urgency, clearly wanting to reunite him with his daughter while minimizing his exposure to the growing crowd of parents and potential media attention. "Mr. Matthews," she called, Zoe is waiting for you in my office." Daniel stood and nodded to the parents who had gathered around him. "Thank you all for your support. It means more than you know. But right now, I need to focus on my daughter." The walk through the school's hallways felt different now. The oil paintings of previous headmasters seemed to watch with new judgment, the Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers suddenly appearing as symbols of privilege that had provided no protection against the kind of prejudice that saw criminality where others saw respectability. Other faculty members appeared in doorways as he passed, their expressions mixing sympathy with the kind of professional concern that comes from working at an institution that had just become the center of a national controversy. Dr. Chen's office door was partially open, and Daniel could hear his daughter's voice inside, not crying now, but talking quietly with someone, probably a school counselor, who had been called in to help process the trauma of watching her father arrested. The sound of Zoe's voice, so young and innocent, made Daniel's chest tighten with protective fury that Cain had forced an 8-year-old to witness something that would probably haunt her for years. "Daddy?" Zoe's voice exploded with relief and joy as Daniel appeared in the doorway. She launched herself from the chair where she had been sitting and ran toward him with the kind of desperate energy that comes from being separated from your primary source of security and comfort. Daniel caught her in his arms and held her close, feeling her small body trembling with residual fear and overwhelming relief. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the federal investigation, not the media circus, not the political implications of what had happened. There was only a father and daughter reunited after a traumatic separation, finding comfort in each other's presence while trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly revealed its capacity for arbitrary cruelty. "I was scared, Daddy," Zoe whispered against his shoulder. "Why did that man take you away? Why was he so angry?" Daniel sat down in one of Dr. Chen's chairs, keeping Zoe on his lap while he searched for words that might help an 8-year-old understand something that many adults couldn't comprehend. "Sometimes people make decisions based on things that aren't fair," he said carefully. "The police officer saw me and made assumptions about who I was and what I was doing without bothering to find out the truth." "But you're my daddy," Zoe said with the simple logic of childhood. "You come to pick me up every Tuesday and Thursday. Everyone knows that." "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Everyone at school knows that." But the police officer didn't know that, and instead of asking questions or listening to explanations, he decided I was dangerous. Dr. Chen, who had been standing quietly near her desk, stepped forward with a kind of gentle authority that had made her one of the most respected educators in the state. "Zoe, what happened to your father was wrong, very wrong, and a lot of people are working to make sure it doesn't happen again." Zoe looked up at Dr. Chen with the trusting expression of a child who had spent 3 years learning to respect and admire the headmistress. "Will the angry police officer get in trouble?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly. "He will definitely get in trouble. What he did was against the law, and people who break the law have to face consequences." Dr. Chen moved to her desk and picked up a manila folder that had been sitting beside her computer. "Mr. Matthews, I've prepared a detailed report of everything I witnessed this afternoon. I've also collected statements from several parents who saw what happened. I want to make sure you have everything you need for whatever legal action you decide to pursue." Daniel accepted the folder with gratitude, knowing that Dr. Chen's documentation would be crucial evidence in the federal civil rights investigation that was already underway. "Thank you, Patricia. Your support means everything to our family." "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "The school board held an emergency meeting by phone about an hour ago. They've asked me to convey their formal apology for what happened on our campus, and they want you to know that Officer Cain is permanently banned from school property." "That's a start," Daniel said, though he knew that banning Cain from the school was largely symbolic, given that the officer would probably never work in law enforcement again. Zoe had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention that children bring to discussions about events that have affected them directly. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" Daniel hugged his daughter closer, feeling the weight of her question and all its implications. "We're going to be more than okay, sweetheart. What happened today was wrong, but we're going to use it to make things better for other families. Sometimes when bad things happen, they can lead to good changes. Like when you prosecute the bad people in court. Exactly like that. Except this time, I'm not going to be the prosecutor. Other people will handle that part, because I'm the one who was hurt. But yes, the person who did this to us will face justice. Dr. Chen's phone rang, and she glanced at the caller ID before answering. St. Bartholomew's Academy, Dr. Chen speaking. She listened for a moment, her expression growing more serious. No, Mr. Matthews is not available for interviews. The family requests privacy while they process this traumatic incident. Another pause. I understand you have a job to do, but our priority is the welfare of a child who has been through enough today. She hung up and turned back to Daniel. That was the fourth media call in the past 10 minutes. I'm afraid this story is getting bigger by the hour. Daniel nodded, having expected as much. The media attention is going to be intense for a while. I hope the school is prepared for that. We're implementing our crisis communication protocol, Dr. Chen assured him. All media inquiries are being directed to our board chairman, and we're working with our legal counsel to make sure our response is appropriate. Officer Stevens appeared in the doorway of Dr. Chen's office, his face red with embarrassment and his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested extreme discomfort. Mr. Matthews? I'm sorry to interrupt, but Captain Morrison asked me to deliver this personally. Stevens extended an envelope with the kind of formal ceremony usually reserved for serving legal papers or delivering official documents. Daniel accepted it while keeping one arm around Zoe, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper on official police department letterhead. Daniel read it quickly, his expression remaining neutral despite the contents. What is it, Daddy? Zoe asked. It's an apology from the police department, Daniel explained. They're saying they're sorry for what happened, and they're promising to investigate everything very carefully. The letter was actually much more than an apology. It was a formal notification that Officer Kane had been suspended pending criminal charges, that the department was cooperating fully with federal investigators, and that Police Chief Williams was requesting a meeting to discuss comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents. But Zoe didn't need to know those details right now. Stevens shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. Mr. Matthews, I also wanted to apologize personally. What Kane did was wrong, and it doesn't represent the values that most of us try to uphold. Daniel studied Stevens for a moment, recognizing the genuine remorse in the older officer's voice. I appreciate that, Officer Stevens. But the real test will be whether the department uses this incident as an opportunity for meaningful change, or just treats it as a public relations problem. Sir, I can tell you that there are a lot of good officers who are horrified by what happened today. We want to be better than this. Then prove it, Daniel said quietly. Not just with words, but with actions. Real accountability, real training, real consequences for officers who abuse their authority. Stevens nodded and withdrew from the office, leaving Daniel alone with Zoe and Dr. Chen. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the school grounds, and the sounds of normal academic life, children playing on distant playgrounds, coaches calling instructions at athletic practices, provided a stark contrast to the crisis that had engulfed the administrative building. Daddy, can we go home now? Zoe asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion that comes from experiencing too much adult complexity in a single afternoon. Yes, sweetheart. We can go home now. Daniel stood, lifting Zoe in his arms, and turned to Dr. Chen. Thank you for everything you've done today. Taking care of Zoe, documenting what happened, standing up for what's right. It's meant everything to our family. It's what anyone decent would have done, Dr. Chen replied. And Mr. Matthews, when you're ready to think about next steps, please know that this school community is behind you completely. The walk back to the Mercedes felt like a victory march and a funeral procession at the same time. Daniel was walking free with his daughter in his arms, but he was also carrying the weight of representing everyone who had ever been criminalized for existing in spaces where others thought they didn't belong. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to create change. As they reached the car, Zoe looked back at the school building where she had spent some of the happiest years of her young life. "Will people treat you differently now, Daddy?" Daniel considered the question while buckling his daughter into her car seat. "Some people might," he admitted, "but the people who matter, the people who really know us, they'll treat us the same way they always have." Like Dr. Chen and Mrs. Thornton and Tommy's mom? Exactly like them. Daniel started the Mercedes and pulled out of the parking lot, driving slowly past the news vans and reporters who were still setting up for evening broadcasts. Through the car windows, he could see camera operators testing their equipment and reporters practicing their stand-ups, all preparing to tell the story of how a routine school pickup had become a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. As they drove home through familiar neighborhoods that now seemed somehow different, Daniel began planning not just his family's recovery from this traumatic afternoon, but the systematic legal and political campaign that would ensure Officer Kane's actions had consequences far beyond his individual punishment. Justice would be served, but more importantly, the systems that had made Kane's prejudice possible would be reformed. The phone call to Patricia had been just the beginning of a process that would take months or years to complete. But it was a process that Daniel Matthews was uniquely qualified to lead. Officer Kane had made the biggest mistake of his career when he decided to arrest the one person in the county with the knowledge, resources, and determination to transform a personal injustice into institutional change. As the Mercedes turned into their driveway, Zoe looked up at their house, the same house where she had lived her entire life, where her father read her bedtime stories and helped with homework, where the world had always made sense and justice had always prevailed. Tomorrow, she would begin to understand that the world was more complicated than she had realized, but she would also learn that her father was fighting to make it better. That fight would define both of their lives for years to come. But tonight, they were simply a father and daughter, going home after the worst day they had ever experienced together.